Ownership. It's a word with an extraordinarily large meaning behind it that many people seem to overlook. To own something is to be in the domineering position over a specific thing. But do we ever think about what the implications behind that are? I don't think that we do. If you're the true owner of an entity, wouldn't that imply that it's yours and yours alone? We as humans have been trying to grasp this concept since we first picked up a stick to wield as a tool. We can see that this stick now belongs to the wielder, and it's in their possession. This is true until something or someone comes and takes it away. If it's not the original owner's thing anymore, by definition, did it ever belong to the original person in the first place? This is what I'm trying to ask. How long of a time span does ownership imply? People don't really seem to think about how long it does imply, which could be a problem. It could lead to dire miscommunications between certain people, therefore damaging interpersonal relationships in the process. Personally, I believe that ownership is meant to imply a long time span in which something is under someone's guardianship. But the fact that it can't be owned forever is where I find the dilemma. If something can't be owned forever, is it owned or is it merely in custody? There have been wars over this concept since we could start developing these abstract thoughts. Wars over land debate this topic, wars over civil unrest debate this topic, even the wars that face the ownership of people debate this idea. Slavery, the controversial topic that's still debated today, revolves around this central idea. Can you own a person? Well, can you own anything? Slave drivers thought they owned their slaves until someone else either came and took them away from them, or the slaves rebelled for their own freedom. Then they weren't owned by anyone, and made their own decisions, eventually gaining dominance over other bits of property and objects. More than likely, they had their property taken away, putting it out of their reach and up for grabs once again. So, does this concept of ownership really exist or have as much meaning as we interpret it to have? If you never can really have true, absolute control over something, do you own it? Well, the interpretation can vary from person to person. The general norm being that it doesn't really have that deep of a meaning. To me, such a concept that's caused troubling quarrels, even wars, throughout history, seems to be worthy of being closely examined. Ownership, and all of its dreaded implications, has been responsible for really nasty topics like racism in general, by making sweeping generalizations about an entire culture or a race simply based on what they owned and how they could protect themselves from the others. The inferior races, quote-unquote, are the ones who own the less advanced technology to defend and demonstrate their intelligence to the other races, who happen to be more fortunate in discovering materials that yielded better items for them. On the topic of social statuses, it can paint targets on a lot of people's backs, such as the Africans in Africa during the apartheid. They technically were the owners of 30.22 million square kilometers of land, which was divided amongst the other nations without the consent of the Africans. Why? Because the other nations owned better technology, they had better militaries, and the Africans had what they wanted, so they took it from them. On the topic of owning land and the cultural differences it implies, not even all people can see the level of absurdity to which ownership could be taken to. Native Americans, for example, were asked if their land could be purchased from them by foreign countries. The Native Americans were absolutely befuddled at this concept. The idea of owning a canyon or owning a field or a living, breathing thing was so confusing and inhumane to them. They had a spiritual connection with their land and the creatures that lived in it, thinking of it as a mutual respect and a beneficial relationship for the both of them. It was a very humble idea. They didn't feel like they were the grand masters over a piece of land. They felt like they were guests and that they should treat their host with respect. If this concept was able to have been adopted by the foreigners, then there's no question that if this was spread, it would have brought on a more peaceful era, and we could abandon this destructive, egotistic, and avaricious concept. The idea of owning something in and of itself only fuels the human ego, further turning us into these imperious and malicious conquerors. Could our race truly thrive and coexist if we're constantly believing that what we own is in our possession forever? The possibilities are very slim. If we're taught that things belong to us without warning of their inevitable departure, we'll turn into a cynical and depressed species that won't be able to find happiness until they have control over their possessions for all of time. We're a greedy species, after all. We keep on taking, but we want more. And what brought this troubling mindset upon our species? The idea of always trying to strive for more. People fail to understand the pull that this word has. It has a much more important meaning than they think it does. It could be the reason why children act so petulant when they have their toys taken away. They're told that it's theirs and that it belongs to them, specifically, only them. They don't learn sharing until later. They own it, but they never think about the possibilities of having it taken away from them, or being shared with someone else. Therefore, causing them to have violent temper tantrums. Unless this connotation is changed, or a different word is used altogether, this could be a big setback on the human's path for enlightenment. So, first, we must wonder if people actually interpret it as a simple word with very little meaning, or a complicated word with a very easily misinterpreted web of definitions. So do you all believe that the general people think of it as a simple word or a complicated word? Frankly, I don't think that it holds true to our collective interpretations. We overlook it heavily, and take it for granted when in reality, the idea of having control over things has controlled us for centuries. The better word I personally think that could describe the idea of having control over something is custody. Custody implies the capricious nature of when that item could be lost, thus preparing us for that day when it should come, as opposed to thinking that we'll have it and we don't have to think about when it could just flee from our control. When something is in custody, that implies that it will be let go in the future, which seems to be a more reasonable idea than having control over something indefinitely. So therefore, this radical concept of ownership we humans conceive is a very brash and competitive concept that puts humans into various grudge matches against each other that end in troubling quarrels, some of which lead to full-scale conflicts. If we, as people, look more closely into the idea of ownership and what it really means, and redefine it so that its connotations could have a less negative effect, then I feel that it could be a true positive step in our species' path to peace.